be in the Driftless area this weekend, and they graciously allowed me to use their office space so that my 20-month-old grandson didn't have to leave the house. So it's just wonderful being with you. It's so impressive, as Thomas said, but we need to move on to the important speakers who are ahead of you. As you know, Russ Green is our first speaker, and he's going to discuss the Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast National Marine Sanctuary. Just a brief bio, and all of our speakers have illustrious careers going, and they're very much in their careers, mid-careers. Russ is a maritime archaeologist and Great Lakes Regional Coordinator for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. After he graduated from the University of Rhode Island, he spent time as a college football coach, commercial fisherman, and small business owner before making his way to East Carolina University for a graduate degree in maritime studies. Really cool, broad experience there. Russ has worked in Great Lakes conservation for 20 years. Many of you can say the same. First as an underwater archaeologist for the state of Wisconsin, and later as deputy superintendent at NOAA's Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary in Michigan. There's so much more to say about Russ, but I don't want to cut into his time. So Russ, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks so much. And thank you, Tom and Bill and team, for an opportunity to share a little bit about the Marine Sanctuary. I'm happy to report that I think all my talks to date have been, well, when we get designated, we will do some things. And it's nice to be able to share with you that we were officially designated in August 16th. And today at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum, we are fortunate enough to have Governor Evers, Senator Baldwin, and other special guests announce the sanctuary. And that'll be streamed on Facebook Live on the museum's webpage. So Wisconsin Maritime Museum Facebook page, and they'll stream the events. That happens at noontime, but it's also recorded. I'm gonna move quickly and share my screen. We are Google people, and so I'm hoping the Zoom is going to work. Hopefully you're seeing that slide. Give me a shout out if not. We'll go to the big screen. There we go. And yeah, so I just wanted to share a few tidbits about the Marine Sanctuary, a little bit of background, super quick, because I hope many folks are familiar with what the path we've kind of journeyed along to get to the point of designation. A quick note about the sanctuary system. Today, we become the 15th National Marine Sanctuary and the latest. So there are 50 National Marine Sanctuaries across the US and into the Pacific, and also 2 National Marine Monuments that are managed by the Marine Sanctuary Program. And the upshot here is these places are very science-based. So the decisions we make about management are all based on science. They're also very community-centered. All of these places have sprung from community interest in protecting a resource off their shoreline, whether it be a coral reef in the Florida Keys or shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. So great to be part of this big system and to be able to draw some of these resources towards Wisconsin. There's some exciting things happening in the Great Lakes. Previously, there was only one National Marine Sanctuary, and that was the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. You see that in Lake Huron. That was designated in 2000. And of course, in 2021, Lake Michigan. And we have a proposal, actually, it's in the designation process for Eastern Lake Ontario. These are all very similar in the resources they protect and the way they are managed. So, I share this because this sub-network of Great Lakes sites, I think, is really important. And all boats will rise on the tide. And as we create, the buzz and the national exposure and the science and the community engagement at any one of these places, it really piques interest in the Great Lakes as a whole. And so we're excited about, having some critical mass in the marine protected areas that the sanctuary program manages.
Hey,
this is the boundaries. Yes.
Russ, real quick, this is Tom. I think you need to just put it in slideshow or presentation mode. Excuse me. So sorry, because I think you're still on the first slide.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if you just go from beginning, and then you should be able to advance with a click of your. There you go.
All right. So sanctuary map.
Yep. Yes, you got it there, bud. Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tom. Thanks for the heads up. So everything I said about the sanctuary system, there you have it. There's the map, and there's the map of the Great Lakes with those 3 sanctuaries I mentioned, and sort of the critical mass of exposure that we're trying to create in the Great Lakes. Here's the final map for the marine sanctuary here, Wisconsin Shipwreck Coast National Marine Sanctuary. It's 962 square miles, focused on shipwrecks. There are 36 known shipwrecks in the sanctuary. And we're actually have bumped up the number on the National Register thanks to the incredible work of the Wisconsin Historical Society. There's now 27 of these shipwrecks on the National Register. And the reason I mention that is because they just have a demonstrated importance and tell a national story of the building of our nation and connect us to the men and the women that did that work. These are incredibly well-preserved sites, and they just offer so many opportunities to leverage them and do work in education, research, recreation, tourism. If we're really creative about the way we manage these places, we can do some very cool things. In terms of kind of an update, I really like to start with the fact that the sanctuary today is the product of a multi-year process that began with a nomination, a community-based nomination and a state-sponsored nomination. And you can read the vision that the nominators had. Tom was part of that crew, Bill, all of the communities along the Lakeshore, Manitowoc, Two Rivers, Sheboygan, Port Washington. And this captures so well the vision they had for the sanctuary. And it turns out that this dovetails really well with the way national marine sanctuaries are managed. These are elements that we use to protect resources by connecting people with these places and making sure, they have an opportunity to value them and protect them. Lots of players in the process to get that done, of course. Next steps, we'll be assembling an advisory council. Each sanctuary has an advisory council. This is a 15-member council that informs the management of the sanctuary. And we have some latitude here to, figure out what kind of seats we'd like on that council. So we'll work with the state of Wisconsin to do that. But typically there's economic development, maritime industry, citizens at large, maritime history, tourism, recreation, fishing. So those folks have a seat at the table as the sanctuary gets underway and we begin the management of this great place. So it's a two-way street. They certainly inform the management of the sanctuary, but they're also ambassadors for the sanctuary and connect us tighter to the communities that they represent or the areas they represent. So we can really look for those opportunities for collaboration. So it's a great opportunity. This will take 6 or 8 months to put together, but at the end of us doing our background work, we'll do a request for seats. We'll do a recruitment, and so you'll hear more about that in the coming months. The other kind of big ticket item that we need to do out of the blocks is to figure out what the NOAA presence will be in each of these communities. This is part of our management plan. That management plan is a roadmap for how the sanctuary will operate over the next 5 or more years, and really front and center. This is in response to the community's vision for this place. What can we do in each of these communities from an infrastructure standpoint to carry on our mission to complement what's happening in each of these communities? So, for instance, partnerships with the Port Explorium is high on the list, and we'll do this in a strategic way. We have now a third party, a contractor that'll help us navigate this process with all of the stakeholders that have worked on the sanctuary, the communities, the state, and other folks that have an interest in this plan. So this one will take a little bit as well. We hope to do this over the next 12 months. We just finished one at the Mallows Bay Potomac National Marine Sanctuary, and it came out great. And there's really a byproduct of this is learning about all of the opportunities in each of these communities and really figuring out what sort of infrastructure makes sense in each of the communities. One of the questions we get a lot is, well, where's the visitor center going to go? And it's a good question. And, this plan will help us, figure that out. Does one visitor center make sense, or do we carve up the pieces and the parts and the programming aspects of that and stretch them along the Lake Coast so we can really create a lakeshore experience for folks? So more to come on that, but we'll be getting that underway pretty shortly.
Hey, Russ, real quick, bud, just jumping in.
Yeah.
because I've had people saying, man, these are beautiful slides, but we just want to see them all. So you're frozen and I didn't pick up on it right away. Forgive me. I think
Oh my goodness gracious.
yeah, if you actually just click on that click on your from beginning, I think it should actually launch into presentation mode. And then
Yeah.
you should be able to click just through to the slide that you want, or however you want to do it. Just if you want to advance the slides as you're talking, that's fine too, manually, just that we all get a chance to see them because they are beautiful slides.
Oh my gosh. Can you see
No
this
worries.
now, advisory council?
Yes.
Okay.
So we see Mallows Bay, Potomac River, National Marine
Oh,
Sanctuary.
okay. There's a little bit of a lag then. What are you seeing now?
Still Mallows.
Okay, great. How about a map on the slide?
No.
No dice.
No. But I've got yours queued up here. If you want me to take over, you can stand down. You let me know.
Let's do that. Let's definitely do that.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Hold on 1 second, folks. See, this is why, hey, advanced prep, right? So those hours
Yeah.
of, and then you just let me know which slide you want me to go to here. I've got the Maritime Museum Facebook page up and ready to go because we wanted to talk about that live event starting, of course, today at noon. So I am going to scroll through here. Let me know where you want me to go. But can everyone see my screen? I see David on my screen. David Franks, maybe a member of our Love Our Great Lakes Day team. Give me a thumbs up if you see my screen,
Yeah,
David.
Tom, it is working.
Great. Thank you, Jim Kettler. Awesome.
Great.
All right. Where you want me to be, Russ?
All right. How about advance? Next slide.
There's
next one. And you can keep clicking. Yep. Advisory councils. We talked about that. We can pause here for a sec. This is the infrastructure plan we mentioned, and there's a view of the lakeshore. Often, because of the existing sanctuary in Lake Huron in Alpena, there's a visitor center there. And, the opportunities on this lakeshore in Wisconsin are so different. So we really want to look at this place as a coastline, and each of these communities with, sizable populations and lots of opportunities to do things in tourism and resource protection and education. So we're excited about that infrastructure study. Next slide, please. And I mentioned that Mallows Bay has recently completed a study.
Hold on 1 second. Sorry. I was in the chat room and then there we go.
Awesome.
Sorry, bud.
Great. There's the Mallows Bay study. Next slide, please. All right. And we're going to bring it home with some consistent slides that overlap what I'm actually talking about. This is a map of Raleigh Point up here in Two Rivers. And we got a grant from NOAA's Office of Exploration to do some work here in August. And this was really cool. This was planned with Sea Grant and the Wisconsin Historical Society. But the idea was to bring new technology, cutting edge technology, to search for shipwrecks in this really dynamic, sandy, shallow environment. And so we put together the grant to do that. Next slide, please. And we used a couple of different pieces of technology. And I mention this because it's a cool example of people wanting to work in marine sanctuaries. This is a drone from the University of Miami, and we dangled a magnetometer, a fancy metal detector essentially, and we kind of combed the shoreline. All the shipwrecks in this area are buried, and the sand is really dynamic. So this was some cutting edge technology to help us kind of look for those wrecks. We also had a private company, Marine Magnetics, come on board, and they said, you know what, this is cool. We want to be part of this. And so we'll donate our sensor. We want to do some research and development. So there's really a few really cool aspects to how we carry out research projects. So if there's someone that wants to test gear, we're gonna put that together and make that happen, because along the way, we're getting great data. Next slide, please. We also had Ocean Infinity. These are a global manufacturer of these autonomous surface vehicles. And the idea here is that this can work uncrewed. This particular one can map for 5 days straight with multi-beam and get a really detailed picture of the lake bed. So this was also a lot of in-kind donations to make this happen from the company. And so we ran this off of Two Rivers, and it gave us great data, but also an opportunity to see how these tools might fit into future work in the marine sanctuary. So, the idea with this is a small footprint, take the people out of it, and get really great mapping. Next slide, please. And then finally, the University of Delaware, they have a fantastic graduate program in maritime studies and environmental survey. And so they brought some tools. This is an underwater autonomous vehicle. And the idea was you find the shipwrecks or something else with the big surface vehicle, and you let this one dive and take some great sonar images. This is an image of an existing wreck, the Galley Nipper, built in the 1830s, the oldest shipwreck in the Marine Sanctuary. So the harmonizing these tools was a big part of the grant. Next slide, please. And all of this data, including existing mapping data that we've acquired over the last couple of years and that we're working on right now. We have a team from the Office of Coast Survey working in the sanctuary. You know, this has to be publicly accessible and it has to be usable to a broad range of researchers. So we're able to take this mapping data and certainly figure out the cultural features of the sanctuary, but also the natural environment, and create lakebed characterization maps that let natural resource managers and scientists use that data to do the work they do. So we've partnered with the School of Freshwater Sciences, DNR, and others on figuring out where we should go map, what kind of tools would they like to see, and then eventually making this data available to them. So this little chunk here off of Manitowoc has something like 300 camera drops. So real time video matched with the sonar signals. And we think we can put that together to make this a really efficient way to characterize the lake bed. Next slide, please. And the final slide here. With a grant from the Great Lakes Observing System, we were able to put 3 real-time wind and wave buoys in the sanctuary. This didn't exist before, and these give boaters, anglers, charter fishermen, and others an opportunity to check in on the weather right now as it's happening in the sanctuary so that they can plan their day safely. One of the cool things about these, we also attached temperature strings to these. So there's really a potential for long-term data being driven by these buoys, and other folks, the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab and others will track this data to figure out what the long-term trends are with water temperatures in the Great Lakes. It also happens that fishermen really like to know what the water temperature is at certain depths. And so this provides them also some data to help them catch more fish. So we're excited about having these out. There's 3, they're publicly accessible, and folks can find these through the GLOS website, glos.com. And I think that's it, Tom. I will wrap there, and certainly happy to take any questions. Sorry about the snafu in the front end.
That's no problem. This is Susan, and Russ, that was a fabulous presentation. I don't see any questions from people out there. So if you do have questions, add those to the chat. We'll try to get to you. But Russ, I'm thinking, obviously in Port Washington itself, as you mentioned, there's a wonderful facility to partner with to start with, and you're going to be forming an advisory committee. If I'm a grade school teacher or principal and think, oh my gosh, ultimately I want my students to benefit from the importance of this sanctuary, what are the kind of things that might evolve?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is an education seat on the advisory council. So there's K through 12 and higher education. And one of the ways that this works so well is for them to just reach out in the early stages. Eventually, as we build out the staff, we'll have an education coordinator that's working directly with all the communities. But in the short time, reaching out to me is a great way to say, hey, I've got an idea. Could we do this? And usually the answer is, yeah, we'll figure out how to do that. And we've done that with some teachers in Two Rivers already. They are kind of ginning up a mural project where they'll paint murals in each community that are sanctuary kind of focused, but also have a curriculum with that as well. So you get arts and culture blending with marine sciences. So we're working on that idea, but I offer that as an example of things we can do. And as we grow, we'll have educators here that can work directly with those educators in the communities.
There was a question about the Wisconsin Maritime Museum, where it's located, and there's information being shared. But if people are not into the chat mode, would you want to discuss that museum a bit? Does that fit into your window?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, they're a great partner and have been through the whole designation process. So they're in Manitowoc. In fact, I'm here right now on the Manitowoc River. Just a really national, world-class museum. Started in 1968 and has kind of expanded ever since then. The World War II sub Cobia is here, so you can take a tour of that. And it really captures Wisconsin's place in the maritime world. I mean, Wisconsin's connection to water defined Wisconsin, and you can learn about those stories here, and lots of really great community-centered stories. They built 28 subs here during World War II, and that effort still rings true in the community, and so that's interpreted here in the community as well. So I would encourage people to come on up and take a look at the museum. There's also a sanctuary gallery, so you can learn more about the Marine Sanctuary here.
So the Marine Sanctuary is so exciting, the whole program. I think, Russ, about the career that, what led you to your career, and other things around education come to my mind, in other words. And as one example, the School of Freshwater Sciences at UWM has just opened up its undergrad freshwater science degree program. There's such a need for scientists and researchers, and I would think that this whole movement around the importance of maritime sanctuaries is also an element of inspiring new researchers and young people to, get into some element of freshwater or water science.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as we build out our infrastructure and we have vessels and platforms for people to do research from, we've done this where a graduate student or an undergraduate student, will have a kind of a signature project working with their professor or their advisor and say, hey, can we get some time on this boat to grab these samples and sort of learn about the sanctuary, but also use that platform to do natural sciences as well. So lots of opportunities there for sure.
Hey, Susan, real quickly, this is Tom. I know we got to close with Russ, both for him, but also for us to move on with Dan Egan. But a reminder to folks to please put your questions in the chat room. I just had somebody text me their question, which is great if I'm looking at my phone, and I was luckily looking at my phone, but I can't multitask with three things. So you're best to put it in the chat room. The real quick question I'm going to convey to you, Susan, for Russ, and it's a good one actually, and it surrounds just how we leverage the network to really bring greater awareness to larger Great Lakes related issues through our sanctuary nomination.
A great question. And I think it will, staying true to the vision that was in the nomination, there are elements of heritage tourism, recreation, education, expanding on what the state has already done. Incredible national caliber state underwater archaeology program here. So all of those elements are true. And I think the facilities study will bring out not just a discussion about the physical stuff we want to do in the sanctuary, but what are the programming pieces that we need the physical stuff for. So Tom, I'm really hoping that infrastructure study gets at exactly what you're saying. How do we leverage the sanctuary in each of the communities in different ways?
Excellent. So Russ, I want to thank you on behalf of the entire team, and I know everybody will be eager to speak with you further. We're going to say thank you and move on to Dan Egan, who's waiting patiently in the wings, I think in New York State at this point. Dan is an incredible journalist. I mean, I don't need to say that. And the bio, which I will briefly read, it doesn't even touch on everything that he has accomplished in his career thus far. He's a journalist in residence, or the journalist in residence at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Center for Water Policy. We'll talk about that a bit. He's the author of, obviously, if you have not read this, you must, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes, a New York Times bestseller. He's a native of Green Bay, Wisconsin, and was a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist during his career with Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. And when Dan's not traveling about, he lives in Milwaukee with his wife and kids. And we're delighted you're here, Dan. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Like your hair. You look very nautical.
Had a busy morning.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So I'd love to dip in, not to what someone might anticipate, your book, which is so important, and we'll go back to that, but to your recent article that was in the New York Times, an incredible, lengthy, gorgeous article, a battle between a great city and the Great Lake. It's not Milwaukee, it's not Port Washington, you're talking about Chicago. So I wonder if, and I'm thinking people will have questions on both that and on back to your book. So in your New York Times article, you write that we'll talk a little about the history of Chicago's water, that it grew from a remarkable geographical quirk. Can you talk about that quirk a bit?
Sure, yeah. Chicago was really kind of a sag in the geographical divide separating the Great Lakes Basin from the Mississippi River Basin. And it was a well-used portage by Native Americans, and they showed early explorers, Marquette and Joliet specifically, where this was and how to transit it. And from that sprung Chicago. I mean, this happened in the 1600s, but that's why Chicago is where it is and is what it is.
And in the meantime, it's done a lot of pushing around of water.
Yeah. So it was a portage. So there was not like a nautical connection between Lake Michigan and a river that would feed the Mississippi. So there wasn't a way to paddle directly from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico. And eventually it moved, became less of a portage and it became a canal and kind of a nautical highway. And there were different iterations of this, but the first substantial one was completed in the 1840s. And so that allowed commerce to really flow from New York Harbor up the Erie Canal across the Great Lakes and then down to the Gulf of Mexico. So yeah, it was all water. That's why Chicago was put where it was.
So part of the undercurrent of more than an undercurrent of the story is climate change, and not only is Chicago built on a swamp, it engineered a crazy infrastructure for its sewage and its water, but storms and erratic weather patterns have come in the way, besides it being a one of the third largest city in the country, right?
Yeah.
So one of the compelling elements, besides the facts that you lay out so beautifully, actually, when I reviewed for our conversation, I thought I'd really like Dan just to read passages from his book, from this article, because your writing it conveys the information so beautifully. Importantly too, in this article, excuse me, there's 3 individuals that you highlight in particular, 2 residents on the south side of Chicago, and how their lives have been impacted back in 1987, then back in the recent spring storm. Can you talk about those people and what you learned about their experience?
Well, yeah, when the New York Times first reached out to me and asked if I was interested in doing some kind of article on the Great Lakes, they didn't have any ideas, and I wasn't sitting there waiting for the call, so I didn't really have an idea. But I thought about it for a little bit, and I thought, Chicago is uniquely vulnerable because of how they've re-engineered their river, and that whole system is premised on the idea that the lake is going to stay within its historic low and historic high level, which is a swing of about 6 feet. And so far it has, but it's showing signs that relative stability is showing signs of getting wobbly as precipitation and evaporation patterns switch. And the biggest piece of evidence of that is that Lake Michigan and Huron went from a record low in 2013 to a record summertime high in 2020. In 7 years, that was 6 feet. And before that would take decades. And so there's nothing saying that the river or the lake had to stop climbing. It was fortunate it did stop when it did, but it still caused flooding. And that, I think, gets to your primary question about these people that I interviewed. So you want to humanize these stories and not just have a bunch of charts and data and historical quotations. And one thing, there's been a lot of excellent coverage on this, but I found that one thing that was kind of consistently lacking was, and not by any stretch entirely lacking, there were different media outlets that did different calibers of jobs with this, but really representing the people on the south side, because when you get flooding in Chicago, you often hear a lot about what's going on, up near Evanston, or if it's along the river, what's going on downtown. But there's people on the south side who suffer chronic floods in their basements. I mean, people in Milwaukee are familiar with this. And it's a heck of a thing to go through. And so when we were kind of sketching out the shape that the story would take, it was agreed upon that we needed to bring in voices from the city that weren't always represented. So yeah, I talked to a bunch of property owners, but a couple of them were featured in the story. And then I think the third person you might have been talking about was the lock master.
Tyrone Valley. Yeah.
Yeah. So he runs the lock at Navy Pier, which really controls which direction the river's going to go depending on the weather conditions. And historically, you know, Chicago sends its waste into the Mississippi River Basin. It's treated waste water. But when things get bad, they can send all that water untreated into Lake Michigan. And nobody wants to do that, but it does work as like a safety valve to keep water out of basements that might otherwise be there, although there's still going to be basement flooding. Anyway, back in May 2020, Chicago got hit with so much rain that it was time to reverse the river and send it back into Lake Michigan. But Lake Michigan was so high because it was at a record summertime high at that point, or close to it. If you open the gate, all you would have done at Navy Pier, if Tyrone Valley opened that gate, he just would have sent Lake Michigan into downtown Chicago instead of the river into Lake Michigan. So he had to wait for a fair amount of flooding. Lower Wacker Drive was submerged. The Riverwalk was underwater. The Willis Tower, Sears Tower, the basement flooded and knocked power all the way up to the top of the tower. And people who control these things or are in charge of managing these water systems knew this was coming, but a lot of other people didn't. And they're wondering, why isn't the river going down? Why aren't we sending it into the lake? And it's because the lake wasn't there to help the city out. And that's kind of the premise of the article. I mean, I think what Chicago's going to have to deal with is both low water and high water. And it can be lower than, may well be lower than anything we've ever seen, and it may well be higher. And then just to underscore how volatile the situation is, if you think about when we talk about coastal cities' exposure to creeping ocean levels, that's exactly what they are. They're creeping. And, you know, storms notwithstanding, hurricanes, that sea rise is happening pretty predictably and incrementally, and it's going in one direction up. So if you choose, and so far I don't think we've done a very good job of choosing this, but you can manage for that and you can have kind of an orderly retreat. And when I talk about sea level going up, they're saying maybe 6 or 7 feet in a century. Well, Lake Michigan did 6 feet in 7 years, and it doesn't take a wild imagination to think what could happen in the next 7 decades. So that's kind of this material we were working with this story. And they did a lot of interactive stuff that I thought really.
Yeah, it really conveys the information. So, you know, back to the Great Lakes is such an important system, so huge and complex. Something that a description you used in that article, you talked about the lakes really functioning more like a slow motion river, which I would never think about, but explain that if you would, and why that adds to the nuances of throw in climate change and fluctuation, and what could that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty common for people to think of the lakes as like a static system. And, you know, the water, sometimes people, you know, are under the belief that the lakes are melted glaciers, and it's glacial water that's just kind of left over as oversized puddles. And that's not the way they work. The glaciers carved the basin, but the Great Lakes Basin, but those lakes are constantly running out to the ocean via the St. Lawrence River, and they're constantly filling up due to precipitation and inflow from rivers that flow into the lake. And I think the number is for like Lake Michigan, if you were to drain it, it would refill. I mean, I don't know how you would drain it, but they call it the residency time. How long does it take for a drop of water to leave Lake Michigan? Another way to look at that is if you drained Lake Michigan, how long would it take for precipitation and inflows to fill it up? And it's 100 years. So, but it doesn't get drained, and it doesn't go up, you know, 400 feet or whatever its average depth is. It pretty much stays shackled to its long-term average. And that's a function of centuries of predictable precipitation and evaporation and outflow. That really, the lakes are like a bank account. The withdrawals are evaporation, water going into the sky, and outflow, water going mostly down the St. Lawrence River out to the ocean. And those losses are compensated for by precipitation and inflows. And it's been exquisitely balanced. And Chicago needs it to stay that way, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And that's where the tension is in that story.
So I don't want to get technical on the writing side, but the writing is so beautiful. I think you mentioned in a previous conversation that it was, you know, a big project. It took a long time. I mean, what sort of time went into writing, crafting that, and working with your partners at the New York Times?
A lot. Because, well, first of all, I wasn't entirely clear when they reached out to me, they give you like a word budget, how many words you have to work with. And it was a lot. And so I figured it was a magazine piece, and a magazine piece is going to have a different kind of tone. And, you don't have to get to the point so quickly. The reader is expecting a payoff. And in the newspaper story, you're kind of like a busker on the street corner. You got to, keep people's attention. So initially I wrote basically a magazine piece. To just say it, the whole thing took about 8 months. And it wasn't 8 months of me pecking at the keyboard. It was, different versions of the story, and then a lot of conference calls. And then this is what really made it such a lengthy process, was bringing in all the visual people. And it was a really interesting experience, because writing, I wrote for the Journal Sentinel for 20 years, and we have a lot of great graphics people and things, but still when you write as a reporter, you have this feeling that it's things will complement the words. And maybe you can talk to a graphics person at the Journal Sentinel and they'll call bunk on that, but that's just kind of the frame of mind that I came up with, having started in newspapers back in the very early 90s. And now with the New York Times, it's more, I guess it would be more akin to like being part of a movie. Like you're just one component, and there are, I think there were like 15, 16, maybe 20, I don't know. I never met them. I never met anybody in person. It was all done online, but there's a whole cast of people putting things together visually, and the words are just one element of it. So it was only about 2 days before it came out in early July that I saw it all together. And it must feel kind of like what an actor feels like once they've edited and assembled and put out the movie. It's like, oh, okay, now I see what's going on here. And so that was a real interesting experience. But I started on it in the fall, and we worked on it right up till we found typos in the opening paragraph, like an hour before it was going online. Typo. I can't even remember what it was. It was like a dropped word or something, but there was tweaking right up to the very end. And it was a very interesting experience.
It was amazing seeing it on the front page of the New York Times. Like, oh my gosh. And I have to say, I recognized your writing right away. I didn't look for your name at first. Like, I thought, oh my gosh, this is Egan-esque. So that was really cool.
I guess I'll thank you for that.
Yeah, my gosh, in my book, yes. So, Dan, let's shift to your role, your current role as journalist in residence with the Center for Water Policy. What is that? What does that mean? What do you do with that?
Well, it's evolved out of. So when I wrote this Great Lakes book that came out in 2017, I started it at the end of 2014, and I had a leave from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, I can't remember, it was 20 months or something. And I, had 4 kids at home, and I just left the newspaper, and I didn't have a place to work. So I reached out to Val Plump, the recently retired dean, and asked if I could rent some space at the School of Freshwater Sciences. And he graciously said, no, we have an office you can use, and we'll make you, I think it was a visiting scholar. There was no compensation or anything, but it was wonderfully beneficial because I had library access, and then I got a study carrel at the library to work at. And so that was continued after the book came out. I think we decided to do it as like a, kind of a shorter term 2-year stint where I would keep that office at the school. And I was doing a lot of book promoting at that time and going out and speaking. And I was speaking representing the university as well. And I think that there's some benefit to that because what I'm writing is so relevant to all the great research that's going on down there. And it also exposes me to the people and the projects going on down there. That really helps me out. Paul Roebber, for example, was a critical piece of that New York Times story. Mm-hmm. And his office is next to mine. And I remember early this summer just being able to walk over his office and run through some very technical stuff that was in that story, and he was able to help me out. And that's just really, just a blessing to have that. Mm-hmm. And so now I broke from the Journal Sentinel. One reason was because I wouldn't have been able to do this New York Times story if I hadn't done that, because you can't work for one newspaper and write for another newspaper. And I had been out of the office for the better part of a decade on various fellowships and whatnot. And and I was under contract to write another book. So I was on another book leave, and it just kind of made sense to make that break. So I think it's really complicated, but the university used to fund my position at the paper, but now the university funds me directly. And the idea is, that I'll be out there representing the university and doing things like this. But right now, my main job is to write this book that I need to write. And it's about phosphorus. It's kind of a biography of phosphorus. And it's not like a second installment of the Great Lakes book, although the Great Lakes will figure prominently in it. But this is a national and an international issue. And that's one of the things I'm doing here in New York right now. I was meeting with the editor yesterday we're going over the introduction, actually. That's normally like the last thing you do, but we want to set the tone just right. So he thought it important that we sit down and go through that. So yeah, my position at the university is to represent it and, to give talks when I can. And I will be much more available to do more talks once I get this book done. But that really is demanding all of my concentration and time at the moment.
So to the phosphorus issue, are you concentrating on the Great Lakes as an example, or is this are you looking
Broader,
nationwide?
Yeah, broader, but there's no getting around, definitely Lake Erie will be a big part of it. And the idea that even Lake Superior is, getting these blooms, and nobody thought that could happen. But no, I've traveled internationally for this, and I will travel some more. And it kind of takes you, if I had time, resources, and lived in a COVID-free world, it would literally take me around that world. I mean, I'm writing about issues in Western Sahara and in Northern Europe and in South America and in the South Pacific. And I'd like to get to Guam.
All with the phosphorus umbrella, all related to
phosphorus and the closely related algal plague that we are suffering. So they're really the same thing.
Right. So for people, I mean, now we're getting into the future, but first, is this a project you wanted to do, or did someone tap you and say, hey, Dan, do this?
That's a good question. No, it was kind of a combination of both. Once that Great Lakes book came out, it came out in 2017, and then it started doing pretty well sales-wise in 2018 when the paperbacks came out. And then the publisher, W.W. Norton, they wanted to do another book right away, and they asked if I had any ideas. And the editor, who is the editor I'm working with right now, is the same editor who did the Great Lakes book. So that's helpful. We kind of understand each other to the extent that we can. But his first idea, and this is an interesting idea, to just do a book about pipes, the history of pipes, what they carry, where they go, who's exposed to them, how they benefit us, how they expose us to various hazards. And I thought that was a good idea, but I was more interested after doing the Great Lakes book and my research on Lake Erie. I thought somebody should just do kind of a biography of phosphorus. And that sounds pretty wonky, and there's no getting around that, but there's a lot of interesting human stories. And that's the real challenge with this book, actually. It's got to cohere, it's got to have like an arc. And, I guess the main character, the protagonist, is an atom of phosphorus, but that it's got to be massaged quite a bit to make it work. So
tremendous.
So it was, I guess, more my idea than their idea, but then we talked about what shape it would take, and we still are. But so yeah, it's a collaborative thing.
Fabulous. So there's a question that's come in, and you knew this would come, Dan. It's about Asian carp in Lake Michigan, and more broadly, the ecological and economic impact of invasives. So at the time that your book was published, that first book in 2017, there were 186 non-native species. Yeah. So where are we? How are the carp? Have you not had time to check on them lately?
Well, I read the news, and I see that we've got I think it's bighead Asian carp DNA in the Milwaukee River, and they also found it up near Sturgeon Bay probably 7 or 8 years ago, and it's not a good sign. But back when they found the stuff up in Sturgeon Bay, I think the consensus, or one dominant theory, was that it was it was just gunk on the hull of a boat brought up to Door County, because this DNA testing is so hypersensitive.
Mhm.
I mean, a fleck of anything can cause a hit. So logic tells you if you have, it's just like a crime, you know, if you have DNA, you can put a person at the scene. This is a little more complicated than that. And I think everybody recognizes the strength and, to a lesser degree, the weaknesses of this technology. But I think it's a great tool that they're using, and I think it really should be used as an early warning system. I mean, what's the point if it's just going to tell us what's already happened? I think this news that we're getting out of the Milwaukee River should just, you know, compel the Army Corps and people in control to do more to stop that passageway for the carp to make their way up through the Mississippi River Basin into the Great Lakes. And that passageway is the Chicago River and the sanitary and ship canal that it's connected to.
Takes us back to Chicago. So, you know, you talked about being through your position being, you know, a voice for the university. In your time and when you've had time to interact with students and watch the evolution of what goes on at UW-Milwaukee and other state universities and other universities on the Great Lakes. But how do you see the research, the new blood coming into the field of freshwater science research?
You know, I think that and I've got 2 college age kids myself, and, you know, there's an increased sensitivity to environmental issues. And I also think there's an increased appreciation of fresh water, and that's what makes the university's School of Freshwater Sciences so important, so critical right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's for good and ill a growth sector, you know, and I think it's great that they've got undergrads into the program now, and hopefully that'll be like a feeder program for more graduate degrees. But yeah, you know, we took the lakes for granted for so long and just treated them as a dumping ground or a, you know, navigation corridor. And I think the generations coming up now are going to be looking at it and are looking at it at the lakes differently. They're valuing it for the freshwater trove and ecosystem that they are.
So you see that awareness and concern, as you said, in your own kids.
Oh yeah, I mean, and it's not because they're my kids, because no matter what I do as a dad, you know, they would not think much of it. You know, it's just what I do. But they do, you know. So the Great Lakes book, for example, was it was the big read over at UW-Madison 2 years ago. So every freshman, some 6,000 kids got a copy of that book, and I think that says, whatever, regardless of whatever it says about the book, it says something about priorities right now and what, you know, the coming generation's interests are. Because I think it was pretty well received. I'm sure there's a lot of doorstops out there that are my book, but no, I think, you know, I graduated from college in 1989, and I went to the University of Michigan, and I remember it used to be kind of a back door to get into the university there if you went through the School of Natural Resources, just because they think they had less people applying. And that was like, so I graduated in 89, that was in the late 80s. And now that, as I understand it, that's like the toughest ticket. And I think that's not, you know, restricted to the University of Michigan. It's everywhere. There's people coming up who have an interest, and climate change is going to drive, you know, a lot of it. And the lakes, as we were talking initially, are exposed to climate change in ways that a lot of people haven't thought about yet. And there's a lot of people who could be potentially affected by this, because there's 40 million of us inside the basin.
Right. So Dan, clearly the people listening in today are largely people who are engaged in some way in conservation, in climate action, you know, at many facets of these areas we're talking about. So one question that's been asked is, what are tangible things that a smaller coastal community such as Port Washington can do today to make Lake Michigan better tomorrow?
That's a hard question.
Come on, Dan, you have to have the answer.
No, I mean, I think, you know, I could tell you, you know, what Chicago should start looking at, and that's, you know, maybe treating that river in a different way and maybe reconnecting it to the lakes. Whatever they need to do, it's going to need to, have the capacity to deal with higher water and lower water. But when you talk about like Port Washington, what can Port Washington do as a municipality? Well, I mean, this isn't a function of the city of Port Washington, but an event like this is a perfect example. I mean, the first step is to get people engaged, educated, and then engaged. And again, as I was saying, it's just for too long we took the lakes for granted. And so I think an informed public, and that can come, it doesn't require reading a certain book at all. It requires making sure that your kids have a relationship with the lake, or your grandkids do, and that they're aware of the issues facing them. And how do they get an appreciation? You take them fishing or swimming, or just for picnics at the beach. And just like what happened with the Milwaukee River, it was a back alley for so many years, and now it's a signature feature of downtown. And the Lakeshore is the same way. And we got to keep doing everything we can to bring people down to that Lakeshore, so they have a sense of stewardship, ownership, responsibility for what we put into it and what we take out of it.
So Dan, the closing chapter of your existing book is titled The Great Lakes Revival, Charting a Course Toward Integrity, Stability, and Balance.
Mm-hmm.
Can we get there?
Well, I think to a degree we're going in that direction, in that we've really throttled what the overseas ships can discharge into the lakes. We haven't completely closed that door to the next zebra mussel or VHS fish killing virus, or quagga mussel, or round goby. Go on and on and on for 186 species. But we have, in the last 10 years, better regulated the industry, and I think we can do more in that respect. But if we can just shut the door to these outside invasions, there'll be, I think, from what I understand, there a new balance will come into existence, and it's already happening, in terms of lake trout populations and walleye populations and whitefish populations. And a lot of that's tied to the idea that the native species have figured out how to make meals out of invading species like zebra mussels and quagga mussels and round gobies. So nature is resilient. These lakes are resilient. They just need to be given a breather and a chance to recover from everything that we've done to them over the last couple hundred years.
Dan, I don't want to say goodbye, but I'm being directed to move on. This has been a great opportunity to speak with you. I know that the people in the audience have benefited from it. We all have. Keep up the work. After you do phosphorus, move on to lead. Not that there aren't any number of books that you could write, but it's so important. Your work is so important, and we all appreciate it. I think that's very safe to say. So,
hey, Susan, real quickly,
million.
This is Tom. Just real quick, I'm going to jump in just because I was going to direct this question to Dan offline, but it's such a beautiful question. I want to ask it, and we'll close with this. It just came in, and it was, have you witnessed an awareness or activism on the part of Native tribes for preservation and restoration of the Great Lakes? And again, forgive me, but rather than send that one offline to Dan, that is a really beautiful question. So I'll leave that with the two of you.
Well, I think that Native Americans have been more in tune with the needs of the lakes than all along. So I don't think that there's some kind of revival. I think, if anything, we're kind of catching up. And I got a little bit of a scold when I was over at the University of Wisconsin-Madison during this big read program, when the freshman class was given this book, and a lot of them were reading it. And I went over to speak to a group of honors students, and there was a Native American woman there who talked about the lack of Native Americans in my book, and I'm guilty. It was, I really looked at the St. Lawrence Seaway as just kind of the point at which my story departed. But I needed to hear that. So yeah, I think more than anything, I mean, I'm not in a position at all to be instructing anybody about their environmental consciousness, significantly so Native Americans.
And that's what makes you the good writer you are, the great writer. Acknowledgement.
Oh.
Dan, thank you so much. I wish you well with your project and safe travels.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. So we have the honor of moving on to Paul Roebber. He's going to be drilling into climate change impacts on the Great Lakes. I'll spend just a little bit of time on Paul's amazing bio. He's a distinguished professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. We're so lucky to have him at School of Freshwater Sciences. He's the founder and director of Innovative Weather, which is an experimental learning program which trains undergrads and grad students in providing weather decision support service to communities. So you hear them on WUWM air all the time. He's an affiliate faculty with the Northwestern Mutual Data Science Institute in Milwaukee, which he might talk about. And since 2016, Dr. Roebber has been contributing to the National Weather Service's Meteorological Development Laboratory data science efforts, which seek to improve weather forecast model information across the country, across, I should say, North America. And he holds active grants with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Science Foundation. That's just the tip of the, in this case, beautiful iceberg. But we want to give Paul as much time as possible for his presentation and for questions that might come up during that. So Paul, welcome and thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for that great intro, Susan. I appreciate that. And Dan Egan was a great segue into what I'm going to talk about. And you'll see my referencing Dan's great book. It really is a fantastic book. He's such a fantastic science communicator. He really clarifies some of those really complicated issues in a way that I can't do. So I really appreciate the work that he does. So I'm going to try to share my screen here and get into it.
Get rid of the rest of them. Or they all go down here, don't they?
Good.
So we need to make sure everybody else's mics are muted, please.
Okay, I think you should be able to see the start. I'll ask somebody to shout out if they don't see it, otherwise I'll assume that it's working.
Tom, that's your job.
So on this first image, I'm just showing a number of different impacts of climate change that all affect us here in Milwaukee. So you see a whole range from very hot to very cold conditions and flooding and sinkholes and all those kinds of things. But in order to get an appreciation of this problem, you really have to take a big picture view first. And this is the biggest picture we could do, which is the globe. And what this is showing is the temperature change since pre-industrial times. And the reason I want to show this, and by the way, I took this a couple of years ago, which means it probably needs to be updated because now the reds are redder. The red indicate much warmer. And as you can see, although we often talk about global average temperature changes, there are differences across the globe in terms of how much that is reflected. And so you can see very clearly that in the high latitude regions in the Northern Hemisphere, there's been the most dramatic warming, but also in some land areas more than the oceans, you'll see that as well. So a really significant regional variation in the warming. And so when you hear about a global average temperature, it doesn't really reflect all of the details that you see. And so that's important when we start talking about what is the impact on the Great Lakes. So one of the great things about the technology in the area that I'm working in is that you can build models, and climate change models are a really useful tool. And they're actually very similar to weather forecast models. And you may not be aware of it, but the ability to forecast the weather has dramatically improved over the last several decades. And the climate models is true as well. It doesn't give you all the details. So for example, if you look at the black line, that's the observed temperature profile. And you can see a lot of ups and downs in that superimposed on this very long-term increase in average temperature. And if you look at the red line, that's the climate model simulation of that same period, including all the drivers, which is both our man-made inputs as well as natural variation in the climate. You can see that it has some of the variation in it, but not nearly the amount of jigs and jags on the short term, say year to year, that the actual climate does. So the climate models are not perfect, but they can certainly pick up the big sledgehammer that is climate change. And that's what you see here, is that very rapid growth. And what's really useful about this is it provides a laboratory where you can subtract those human drivers and say, what would the climate look like if you took that out? If we hadn't been putting that stuff into the atmosphere for the last several hundred years? And you can see it's pretty flat. It's not nearly that kind of rapid growth that we're actually seeing. Now, if you look at the scale on the right, that's degrees temperature increase in Fahrenheit. You can see it's a little bit above 2 degrees through 2020. That may not seem like a lot, but I refer you back to this, which is there's a lot of regional variation, and a lot of those changes are much, much larger than 2 degrees. That's an average over the entire globe. And that's really important to recognize, that this is not, oh, our temperature is going to be 70 degrees instead of 68. That's not what this is saying at all. So let's look at the trend in carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And we've had that measurement at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii since I think 1959. And that's the figure on the right, showing that long-term trend. It's very clear what that trend is, up and up and up and up. You can see there's also, if you look at the figure on the left, you can see there's a cyclical variation associated with the seasons. So that's kind of like the breathing of the earth in and out as the green up occurs, and then during the cold season. But the overall trend is very clearly upwards. Now, there was a 6% drop in carbon dioxide emissions in 2020, thanks to COVID. But even as early as the fourth quarter of 2020, they had already gone back up above sort of the average of the prior years. So it was actually increasing even in 2020 towards the end of the year. And also very important to recognize, just because you drop the emissions in a year doesn't mean the concentration in the atmosphere actually falls down. And you can see that on the left, that even though emissions were down 6% in 2020, the amount of the concentration in the atmosphere still increased. Why is that? It's because it's like a bathtub. If you have a drain and the drain is mostly plugged and you turn down the tap, but you don't turn it off, it's still going to fill up the bathtub. And that's what's happening here. What we're doing in the United States to sort of combat this issue has mostly been a transition to natural gas for energy production. That's useful, but natural gas is methane, and methane is also a greenhouse gas, and it has very powerful characteristics in terms of its influence on temperature. And so if you look at the curves on the right, you'll see that the red curve represents the warming effect of methane or natural gas, and the same amount of carbon dioxide emission is the blue curve. And there's two things that are important here. One is that methane is more powerful, but it's at a shorter time period than the carbon dioxide. So in other words, our transition to methane, this is not talking about leakage, this is just about using methane to produce energy. You'll find that we're going to have to pay for that in the short term, more so than if we'd been actually burning coal, believe it or not. However, on the longer term, we do get a benefit from that. So there's a trade-off there. So it's clearly not the solution. It helps, but it's definitely not the solution. So if you look at people who are showing, look how much the United States has been doing in terms of our contribution to global warming in recent years, it's true that we are doing something. I won't take that away from us, but we're also not doing all that we could. And furthermore, I think one of the biggest things that we could do as a nation would be to provide leadership so that other people would not have an excuse, as easy an excuse to say, you're not doing it, why should we do it? If we provide that leadership, it sort of brings us all on the same page. And the reason I say that is because our emissions are much less now than China and India in particular. And if we don't get international cooperation on this issue, we can't really get very far in terms of combating the problem. So it's really important that we get international collaboration. And by sending a signal to everyone else that we're very serious about this is the first step in doing that. So the climate modelers, what they do is they say, okay, let's project different sort of emission scenarios. This is from the last International Panel on Climate Change report and showing different representative concentration pathways. That's what they call it. Basically, all you need to know is the red line is sort of business as usual, which is pretty much the pattern that we're on right now. And the other three curves represent adjustments, some really strenuous adjustments in terms of our emissions. And you can see that the business as usual scenario is just leading to tremendous increases in carbon dioxide concentration. So we're already above 400. And you can see that under a business as usual scenario, we'd be on the order of 1200 by the end of the century. So that's unimaginable in terms of where we would be, but we don't have to imagine it. We can model it and see where we'll be if we do that. So the other important point that I want to mention here is that I have a nice little saying that I like to quote, which is climate is what we expect, but weather is what we get. And what I mean by that is that what is the climate? The climate is really the aggregation of all those individual weather events. And so if you compare, let's say, the climate of the Pacific Northwest in the US to Milwaukee, the average annual temperature is not all that different. But we know very well that the climate in the Pacific Northwest of the US is extraordinarily different than it is in Milwaukee. In particular, they have much milder winters than we have. And they also have very heavy rainfall in the winter, many, many cloudy, rainy days, whereas our precipitation is more uniform throughout the year and it changes phase from rain to snow as we go from summer to winter. So climates are very different. So it's important to recognize that when you're looking at averages like annual average temperature, that doesn't really reflect all the details. And it's the details that are important. That's what you experience as climate. So let's give an example of that. So in 2013-14, we had a really cold winter in the Midwest. You probably remember that very well. Also true in the Northeastern United States. This is the average temperature departure throughout the globe. And you can see that year was actually a record-setting warm year globally. And many places, almost everywhere, was well above normal, but we weren't. So even within a long-term trend of warming, it doesn't mean you won't get these kinds of opposite sign events occurring. It's not a signal that global warming isn't happening. It's a signal that the climate has a lot of natural variation within that framework of a long-term trend that's upwards. And that's really important for us too, especially when we're talking about things like Great Lakes water levels. That regional influence is what we experience. It's not the global transition that we see, it's the regional effect. So sometimes some parts of the United States, such as us in the Midwest, think that we have immunity against climate change. We do not. The map on the lower right shows current hazardous conditions, threats, natural hazard conditions. In the Midwest, it's heavy rainfall and flash flooding and tornadoes. In the Northeast and Gulf Coast, what you see are hurricane landfalls being the threat. Out west, it's wildfires and earthquakes. So the earthquake is not something that is affected by climate change, at least we don't think so. So it's the others, but the others are all increasing. We know that, we've seen that a lot in the news of late. We already know that they're increasing. We have direct evidence of that. And we expect that to continue going forward with climate change. But now I want to take a trip to Greenland. And this may not seem very relevant to us in the Midwest, but it actually is. And I'll explain why. So this is the plot on the left is the mass loss of Greenland's ice sheet going back to 2002. And what we're looking at here is a loss of 4,000 billion tons of ice. If you can imagine that, I can't. It's hard to imagine that, but this is what it looks like on the right. Massive rivers of meltwater from the ice flowing to the ocean. And you might expect that might have an influence on the world, and it sure does. Sea level rise, Dan Egan mentioned that. Under a lower emission scenario, so if we take really drastic efforts to reduce emissions globally, then we might see 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. That's a best case scenario. A more business as usual scenario might be as upwards of 8 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And that's not the end of it, because the sea levels will continue to rise after that, particularly in a business as usual scenario. If just the Greenland ice sheet melts because we continue on that business as usual scenario, we're talking about a commitment of 125 feet of sea level rise. And if you do a map of the United States and look at what that looks like, it's quite impressive in a depressing sort of way. And we're also here, I'm just talking about Greenland. Another important ice mass, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, is the Antarctic ice shelf. And that's an additional extremely large amount of sea level rise coming from that as well. So we're just talking about Greenland. Some of you may be aware that the polar ice is also melting. It's become much more open for shipping and things like that in recent years. That doesn't actually affect sea level rise because it's floating on the water. But it certainly has an effect on the climate because it doesn't reflect that radiation back to space, which means we can warm even more rapidly than otherwise. So why do I talk about sea level rise when people are asking me to talk about the Great Lakes? The reason is because about 40% of our gross domestic product and 40% of our population live and work in shore adjacent counties in the United States, which means that at least one boundary of that county is on the water. And so if you're talking about anywhere from 4 to 8 feet of sea level rise, you're talking about pretty significant impacts on those areas, and those people have to go somewhere. Just to give you an example, you can see behind me the Boston Red Sox thing on my closet. So I'm from Boston originally, so I come by that fandom honestly. This is the Boston looking down on it. And the blue areas are areas where that sea level rise inundates the city. And so Fenway Park, sadly, is underwater, as are many other parts of Boston. In fact, what you see are kind of like an island sort of setup, which is actually the way it was in the Revolutionary War. So we're sort of going back to pre-modern times where they did the landfill and actually got some of that land to use. So tremendous inundation. You can look at other places. Miami is just absurd. New Orleans is also absurd because of that sea level rise. So that's one impact. Another impact, of course, as we know, are hurricanes. They're becoming more intense with global warming. And the reason for that is because a lot of the heat has actually gone to the oceans. And the ocean temperature is the driver, the energy source for the hurricane development. So when they do form, they tend to be much more intense. And of course, some of those make landfall. And this is a big threat, of course, to coastal regions. So what does that mean? Here's a projection of what people will do in the United States as they're affected by these areas. So the blue areas are places that are being strongly affected, and the colored areas represent places that people are going to. Now, if you look at this map, you might see, oh, well, nobody's going to the Great Lakes area. And that seems to be true from this projection, but my guess is that the economic consequences of people migrating to these other areas will raise the costs of those areas. And then people will look to the Great Lakes area and say, oh, this is relatively cheap. And that will become more attractive. And so I think the flows will be somewhat modified from this. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, this is just in the United States. When you're talking about climate change, it has tremendous worldwide impacts in terms of that sea level rise and hurricanes. And there's going to be massive climate migration associated with that. So if you think the immigration problem that we're experiencing now in the United States is something that's a problem, just wait a few years and see what that's going to look like, because people have to go somewhere. And some of them are going to be trying to come to the United States. This is a projection of days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the current map on the top and projections for 2100. And so the Midwest, basically something like a month of above 100-degree days is what we're looking at on this map, which is pretty incredible. The map on the right shows what our climate will be like in 2100, and those arrows represent places that are similar to our climate in 2100. And so basically, our climate looks like Arkansas. That's effectively what we're talking about when we're saying Milwaukee's climate is changing or Chicago's climate is changing. We become more like Arkansas. Tornado activity as a whole actually will probably diminish with climate change. We already see signals of that, but the days with massive outbreaks will increase. And we've seen a rapid increase in those days over the last decade or so. And we expect that to continue with climate change, because even though the days where tornadoes are supported, there's a lot of details that go into that, are probably fewer. Those special days when they can really develop will have more energy available to them because of the moisture in the atmosphere, and they'll have much more severe days as a result of that. Likewise in the Midwest, so tornado threat is a big one for us. Another one, of course, is heavy rainfall. And this is what we've already observed in terms of heavy precipitation, a 30% increase in heavy rainfall in the Midwest. Northeast has also seen a really significant increase. And that's expected with climate change because we're increasing the amount of moisture available in the atmosphere as a result of the warming. So that means flood risk, both from the coastal areas associated with hurricane landfalls, but also in the Midwest because of those heavy rainfalls. And I just saw an article a week or two ago showing that insurance rates will be increasing by 18% per year for the next 20 years as a result of that for those at-risk properties. And so that's also going to probably encourage some migration away from those areas. What about drought? So an irony of climate change is that even though you get more heavy rainfall, we also get more drought. And it's because the hydrological cycle is enhanced, evaporation is drastically increased with that heating. So if you're not getting rain, it's easy to lose that moisture. And so the Midwest is affected much more by drought. Presumably in the North Woods area, they'll get more wildfires as a result of that. So those kinds of impacts that we haven't traditionally thought much about in the Midwest will become much more of an issue. And then lastly, I want to go back to something that Dan was talking about quite a bit, and I have a shout out here to his book. It really is a great book. He discusses this issue of Lake Michigan water levels in great detail in that book and really makes it quite clear. And really what we're talking about with Lake Michigan water levels, historically, it always has varied. There's a natural variation in water levels in Lake Michigan. But what's changed is the driving for those water levels. As Dan mentioned, the water balance is really just like a bank budget, and precipitation historically has been the main driver for lake levels to bring them up, and evaporation has been the main feature to bring them back down. And what's changing with climate change, of course, is the evaporation component as well as the precipitation component. So both those drivers are changing. One of the issues that we have is with the warming, especially over the winters, we have much less ice cover than we used to have over the Great Lakes. And because of the way the Great Lakes behave hydrologically, it means that the warming of the lakes will increase very rapidly over the summer, so that you get 80-degree Fahrenheit temperatures of the surface waters in August. This is happening relatively frequently these days. It never used to happen. And that means as you start getting into some of those cooler days in the fall, you have much more evaporative loss than you used to have. So a lot of water going out of the Great Lakes because of that. So that balance between precipitation and evaporation is something that I've modeled. And so on the left, this bar chart just shows the high levels and the low levels on the top and bottom, and the red circle represents the average level. And so actual historical values from observations on the farmost left. And then based on this model I built, the simulated historical levels, which captures that variation pretty well as the average. It's a little bit below, but not much. And then 4 different climate change scenarios, all based on regional climate models, to see what would happen to the Great Lakes water level, Lake Michigan, Huron water levels with those scenarios. And the biggest thing to take away from this, the most important thing, is it's the variation that will increase. So what Dan was talking about, from extreme highs to extreme lows, and occurring in a much more rapid fashion than historically was the case. So we could get highs that are much higher than they ever have been, and lows that are lower than they have been. And doing that in a matter of just a few years versus decades as being the transition. So that's a really important consequence. It's actually not clear whether lake levels themselves will drop on average, which is what we used to think. But because of that balance between precipitation and evaporation, that may not be the case. If we have a lot of precipitation along with very warm conditions, the lake level may not change very much on average, but it'll be bouncing around from those very high levels to very low levels. So it's really a tale of two Lake Michigans. Top figure, an image from Door County in 2010, which was actually 3 years before the record low level. So even now you can see before it hit the lows that it was really receding quite a bit from the shoreline. And then down below there is just the high levels that we've been experiencing in recent years. And so if you want to read more about a lot of these issues, especially pertaining to the United States, I highly, highly recommend the 4th National Climate Assessment. This is something that is required by law that we do every few years. And these are very well done reports and done in a way that lay people can understand quite clearly. The International Panel on Climate Change submits their own reports, and they are globally based. Unfortunately, I find that the writing there is not nearly as clear as it is in the US climate assessment. So I often recommend people take a look at that one first, at least, before going to any sort of IPCC report. And it's based on a tremendous number of scientific studies. So it's really well grounded in scientific evidence. And so I want to just talk about some takeaways from this and wrap it up. So basically, a lot of science issues here, but in order to actually do anything, it requires socio-political action. The science can only tell us the pathways that we're on and possible scenarios that we could follow, but they can't tell us what to do. We have to decide to do it. We've been talking about this issue for decades now, but we really haven't done very much to combat it. The other important point, just like with COVID, there's a lag between any action we take and nature's response. So anything we do today is not going to affect what we have to experience for the next few decades. That's going to be based on what we've already done. So we're looking at the longer term changes that we have to make to salvage things down the road, but we're still going to have to pay the price that we've already encountered. So there's economic costs and human costs to taking action or not taking action. The question is, what do you want to bear in terms of those costs? In my opinion, this should motivate rational consideration with an emphasis on expertise and evidence, but it's pretty clear that hasn't been the case. And so each year that passes without addressing this makes mitigation, reducing the impact of climate change, less possible and much more expensive. And so it already means, based on where we are now, that adaptation to climate change is a must. We're going to have to do that regardless of what we do in terms of mitigation. So an important point is to increase resiliency. We can't, if the sea level is going to rise 8 feet on the coast, basically there's not a lot you can do to increase resiliency there. But if we do some action, we can actually increase resiliency in those areas. If you think about the heavy rainfall that occurred in New York City recently, and the deaths that occurred because of people living in basement apartments, that's something we can do something about. Just like in the heat waves that we've experienced back in the 90s, we had a massive heat wave in Chicago and Milwaukee, and we had hundreds and hundreds of deaths as a result of that. We've made some changes since then and allow people ways to actually find more cool conditions during those heat waves and have really reduced that impact. So there are things that we can do just in terms of increasing resiliency, but we really need to operate on both those levels, mitigation and adaptation, not leave it all to one or the other. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully there's still time for a couple questions.
So Paul, my commentary is that you are a great science communicator, so don't think that you're not. People are saying that this year presentation is amazing, but as always, looking to what you might see as positive mitigation actions that you see occurring now. Are there examples of that you've seen either locally, regionally, or nationally?
There've been a lot of things that the people have tried to do. It hasn't been, I think, coordinated at a national level to say, okay, this is our our moonshot effort that the government actually coordinates and runs. And I think that's what's really required, because again, I think that sends a signal internationally that we're serious about this and that other people need to get on board. That's how you get people to actually work together on an international scale. So we can do a lot of things locally and that helps, but it doesn't solve the problem unless we can deal with it internationally. So that's my one I don't know what the word for that is, but my one hesitancy about that. I would say that in terms of mitigation efforts, the switch to natural gas has been a partial solution, but it's clearly not the solution. So, going towards alternative energy sources. I recently had to travel to California, and I drove rather than flew. My car actually has really good gas mileage, so I didn't feel too bad about that, but I had to get out there. And going through Iowa, it's just astonishing how much wind energy they're producing there. And it's over 30%, and has been for a number of years, over 30%. Here in Wisconsin, I don't know what the latest figure is, but somewhere around, I think like 5% tops. And so our wind climate is not as beneficial as Iowa, but it's not that different either. We could generate a lot more energy just from wind if we decided to do it. I also think, the decisions we can make in terms of infrastructure. The Biden administration has talked a lot about infrastructure, and I think that is key from a climate change perspective. We have to make it easier for people to do this as part of their everyday activities. If you don't do that, it's really hard for people to do it. And we don't have an infrastructure in the United States right now that really allows us to do that so easily. And so I think that would be a huge benefit. We saw a 6% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions in the United States because of COVID. That was primarily because of transportation. And so just that one sector changed it by that much. So if we have an infrastructure that supports that, we could actually do a lot more than we're currently doing. So I think there's many things that we can do. We just haven't done it.
So Paul, I'll close with just real quickly, Tom, I would like to say this because I think in previous conversations that you and I have had, Paul, you haven't said this, but I will say that you can, obviously your contribution to science and research is huge. You funnel lots of energy in nurturing students to carry on the torch, but you also spend a lot of your time when you can are asked to do talks like this, because I believe you've told me that a groundswell of citizens saying this must happen could be required, is likely would be required to make this the kind of change that we're talking about.
Yeah,
am I right?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Susan. I think that's absolutely correct. It is the groundswell that forces leadership to really take it seriously. And so the more that people understand what we're facing here, the more likely that is. I think I have seen a transition in public opinion over the last few years on this issue, which I think is very encouraging. Unfortunately, it's really easy to postpone action on climate change because everybody thinks, oh, that's next year or next 10 years or next 50 years. It's not something I need to do right now, but there's a lag between the action we take and the impact that we'll feel. And so every year that we waste by not taking action just makes it harder for us to actually limit the damage. And that's really what we're talking about here, is limiting the damage.
Susan, I'm glad
the message is clear and we appreciate it.
Yeah, Susan, I'm glad you offered that. That was excellent. It was far more important than my closing remark to Paul, which was simply going to be that, on behalf of all the participants on the call here today, unless we have some Yankee fans, we wish your Boston Red Sox good luck until they match up against our Brewers in the World Series. Then you're on your own, Paul.
Well, I'm looking forward to that matchup. All right,
okay, so we're going to take this back to science, and thank Paul once again. It was a tremendously important presentation and well executed. We now welcome Dr. Jennifer Phillips-Vanderberg, who gets the award for the most beautiful name and also an important topic, which is science-based actions communities can take to make the Great Lakes and the animals that depend on them thrive. So Jennifer, just very briefly, because we want to give her total time for her important presentation, is the science director of the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory. She leads the observatory towards fulfilling its mission, which is conserving birds and bats in Wisconsin and throughout the Western Great Lakes region. We know how important that is. She, in that role, coordinates research, monitoring, and education. And her current work focuses on improving conservation of birds in human-dominated areas, and we know there's lots of those, and expanding understanding of migration in the region, also very important. Before coming to this position, Jennifer worked as a life scientist with the Environmental Protection Agency in Chicago, so brings a very important perspective there. And that role was addressing pollution control issues in the Great Lakes region. So Jennifer, thank you so much. Thank you for your patience and queuing up for this final and important presentation. So take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Just checking, can you see my screen?
I can see it.
Okay, awesome. So thanks for being here, and thanking all of you for lasting until the very end of this presentation. So we've heard a lot of great things that are happening in the Great Lakes and a lot of the challenges that are approaching them. But I wanted to leave you guys with some things that you can do about it, that each one of us can do to show love for the Great Lakes and do things that actually help reverse some of the negative threats that are threatening them. So I'll be going through 6 science-based actions and some sub-actions on how you can do that. And I know I'll be going through a ton of information. So I will be sending around a packet with additional information so that you don't have to take perfect notes. And if I gloss over something that you don't totally understand, you can go back to that and get lots of how-tos, exactly how to implement this stuff, so that it's hopefully a little easier than approaching it from the really high-level view that I'm taking now. So before I can talk about what we can do about it, I have to just go through a few of the kind of depressing threats that the Great Lakes are facing. So this looks like pollution, which looks like everything from fertilizers to sediment to medicines, all get into the Great Lakes and the waters that feed into it. Invasive species, we've already touched on this with previous speakers, things like quagga mussels, zebra mussels, Phragmites, but this also is some of our terrestrial species as well, because the Great Lakes are greatly affected by the land that forms their watershed. So even though we're on land, the waters that feed the Great Lakes come from that land and flow off of it and bring other things with it. And so threats on land can have consequences for the lakes themselves, and they're all connected. And then water movement and usage. So this looks like runoff, erosion, withdrawals, how we use water and how that actually changes how ecosystems function. And I'm not going to be talking about climate change because you just heard tons of really great information about climate change, but I really recommend you diving into the literature about what you can do. So I'm going to really be focusing on these first 3 and what you can do about them. So this is kind of the outline of how you can help for pollution, looking at how some nuts and bolts ways of how you can reduce chemical and plastic usage, how you properly dispose of chemicals, how you make sure you aren't contributing to new invasive species and controlling the ones we already have, as tough as that is. And then looking at how your personal water choices, so water conservation, and then how you landscape around your yard and communities through green infrastructure can affect how water moves and help protect the Great Lakes. So water pollution is a really, really big topic. So I will be breaking it down into kind of 3 big categories that I think most people are familiar with and can do something about. So fertilizers, things that make plants grow better, or that's what people are hoping for when they add fertilizer. Herbicides and pesticides, so things that kill, chemicals that kill, and plastics. Plastics come in a few different forms, and I'll be talking about those a little bit more detail. But for each one of these, you can kind of think of it in similar ways. So what you're trying to do is eliminate and replace what you can, use the least harmful option in the least harmful way when you can't replace it, and then disposing of them properly. And I'm going to go through how to do that for each of the 3 categories. So fertilizer usage. So fertilizers, it's already been touched on about how harmful, especially phosphorus-based fertilizers are, but nitrogen-based fertilizers can have some problems too. How they can cause these really massive algae blooms that then can cause massive problems for both smaller lakes and the Great Lakes themselves. So the fundamental problem is fertilizers get into the water, run off the land, and when they get into water bodies, they can often cause harmful algae blooms that disrupt ecosystems, and in some cases are actually toxic. And this, you can actually see this from space. So this picture here, that bright green in the Saginaw Bay and Lake Erie is actually algae blooms. And this caused a few years ago a lot of the intakes from Lake Erie to have to shut down. So communities didn't actually even have drinking water. So these can have massive consequences on the Great Lakes, but also on small scale lakes as well. So there are growing numbers of dogs that have died from drinking water that has these algal-based toxins in them, and it can make people really sick. So this is on every size lake can be a problem. So what can you do about it? First of all, really consider if you can reduce or stop fertilizer usage. A lot of people do it just because they've always done it. So really think about what are you trying to accomplish, and can you reduce that? Ask questions of your lawn service if you have one. They should be able to tell you what they're putting on, how they have to put it on, and make sure you're an informed consumer. Is what they're saying what they're actually doing? So a lot of fertilizers have restriction or have guidelines saying you shouldn't put them out right before it rains. Is your company really doing that? And just being that informed consumer and asking those questions really does help. If you do use fertilizers, only use them in ideal conditions. That goes for both you, but also anybody you hire. And never apply fertilizer in your water bodies. It just means that you're fertilizing water bodies. And if you don't have enough space between your fertilizer and your water body, it means that there's not enough plant matter between the two to actually take up that fertilizer and utilize it. And then utilizing green infrastructure whenever possible. And I'll be talking about green infrastructure a little more in a bit. And then buying organic where it's feasible, which it isn't always, but it supports farmers that are using less fertilizer and less herbicides and pesticides. And that brings us to reducing herbicides and pesticides, which have a lot of problems. Namely, they kill a lot of non-target species, so things you don't mean to kill, and pollute waters and disrupt those ecosystems in those waters when they run off. And this happens in the Great Lakes, but especially in tributaries to the Great Lakes. And we're learning more and more about how they can harm people too. Groundup is a really common example where that's being linked to cancer, but we're learning more about a lot of these kind of more traditional pesticides have a lot of negative consequences for folks. So what can you do about it? Plant species that don't need as many chemicals. And I'll be talking about native species as one of those. But another thing you can do is ask, is this chemical necessary? So sometimes this means reframing how you think about aesthetic choices in your yard. Are a few bites out of your leaves okay? And if it is, then maybe taking a step back from some of your pesticides is a good choice. I had to deal with this personally. I mean, every gardener has to deal with this. So for example, I have a bunch of milkweed in my yard. A couple of them got completely infested with aphids. And when you read how to get rid of them, a lot of them say spray. And I was really reluctant to do that because the whole point of is to try to support caterpillars of monarchs. So it seemed a little counterintuitive to be spraying them. And instead I got to, after asking myself that kind of question, I decided to not spray and instead got to watch kind of what I think of as kind of an Animal Planet moment of watching all of these ladybugs come eat those aphids. And then also it was the first time I really got to watch ladybug larvae, which are completely fascinating and bizarre looking. So just thinking about trying to reframe how you see your garden is, I think, a really helpful thing to do. And again, just like fertilizers, you should be an informed consumer of your lawn care company. Use the least toxic option. And again, buying organics, because organics are a way for both less fertilizers and less pesticides. We're all familiar with plastics, so I'm not going to go too much into macroplastics. So the big plastics, I think most people know what they look like, and that when animals get into them, it can cause lots of problems. But microplastics are kind of what happens when larger plastics either shed little pieces or larger plastics break down into smaller pieces. And this is still a really active area of literature, but we're learning more and more about how those chemicals actually can be conduits of other chemicals, so that are more toxic. So it's a way, like, by reducing both macro and microplastics, we can reduce some of these risks both to humans, but also to wildlife. And so what can you do? Choose plastic alternatives. This is pretty common sense. So looking for limiting packaging. What has been really exciting to me is seeing more companies offer this. So things like Tide now has a low plastic container option, where like the main container is made out of cardboard. So trying to look for those opportunities and supporting those companies that are making those choices. Metal, glass, and ceramic containers are great options. And eco-responsible natural fibers are also a great option, because a lot of our microfibers are actually coming from laundry of fleece. Fleece is the number one, or the one that produces the most. But all of our synthetic fibers shed. Actually, all fibers shed, but it's just, does it turn into plastic or does it biodegrade? And then I'm sure you guys are all aware about ditching single-use plastics. So use refillable whenever possible and do your best. So last step in the cycle is disposing of those chemicals responsibly. And this is any of the ones we've been talking about. And the problem is that improper chemical disposal means chemicals get into our Great Lakes and they can do a lot of different things. And even things that seem like small amounts, like medicines, are actually being picked up in tributaries to the Great Lakes. And there's growing research that animals are affected by them. So what can you do about it? Use hazardous waste and medical collection in the resource packet. I will have some links to how to find that in Wisconsin, but a lot of communities have this. When in doubt, don't just blindly throw it out. Look it up, figure out what is the right way of disposing of these chemicals. Never pour anything down a storm drain. For most of the Midwest, it just goes straight into your river. So without any treatment whatsoever. So this is just, think about whatever you're dumping onto streets or down storm drains or onto your driveway is just dumping it straight into your river. And when all else fails, remember to reduce, first reduce, then reuse, then recycle. The classic is always still valid. And then just a couple of things for microplastics that aren't kind of this traditional thought here is wash plastic-based fabrics as less frequently as possible, because it means less shedding of those microplastics. And then also consider bags or filters that actually filter out those microplastics. That's another option. So onto invasive species, which I'm sure you guys have all seen. So here's Phragmites dominating a lot of coastal communities and wetlands. And the problem is they disrupt ecosystems in all different kinds of ways, and that could be a whole nother talk. They also cost billions of dollars and outcompete native species. So they just wreak havoc everywhere. So what can you do? Utilize native species so you're not the source of the next invasive. Slow the spread of what we've already have. So there's the two big ones. So how do you do that? You can slow the spread by washing gear. So when you go out boating, go out fishing, make sure you inspect anything that is big enough to see with the naked eye, pull that off, and then wash everything else down, because a lot of our invasive species are really good at hiding. So they have eggs or larvae or things like that that just get attached to things and you don't even see them. So make sure, and in the packet, I have protocols on how you actually do that. Don't move firewood. This has become a really big deal with emerald ash borer, but there are other invasives down the pipeline that can be spread by firewood as well. So even if you already have emerald ash borer, still don't move firewood. Be a responsible hiker. So as much as leave no trace is really important, what I'm talking about is making sure you clean all your boots and gear between sites. So don't be carrying any little burrs or hitchhikers, or don't let your pets spread them as well when you go hiking or out into communities. Make sure you remove invasive species. So this can be as simple as weeding your yard. Tons of people have garlic mustard and Dame's rocket in your yard. So start there. And then if you still have energy left over, participate in invasive species removal events. And there are lots of great ones by local nonprofits right in your community. And if I can, I am biased, but because I study birds, but I think utilizing natives is one of the best ways to help the communities around here in human dominated spaces, helping birds, water quality, and other organisms. And that's because they need a lot less chemicals and a lot less water. They're great for green infrastructure, so slowing down water and filtering it before it gets into stormwater systems. And they support a lot of birds and pollinators, which form the basis of a lot of food chains. So a lot of our pollinators have to have native species to survive. And if we can plant those and support those, it means that we're supporting the base of food chains that then can support the rest of the things living in the Great Lakes. Lastly, I'll be talking about a couple of things about water conservation and movement, because to address kind of two related problems. Our infrastructure, as folks have talked about earlier today, is getting old and it's under a lot of strain. And we're wasting energy, chemicals, and increasing that strain on that infrastructure by using more water than we need. And it can exacerbate, it can make worse some of the problems that we are seeing with that. So, and then the secondary one is when water moves quickly off the land, it causes erosion and runoff. So that pollution I was talking about at the beginning, a lot of it is mobilized by water moving too quickly off of the landscape. So how do we do this? Don't be overwhelmed by this definition, because I'm going to walk it through, but green infrastructure is such a giant, diverse thing that this is actually the best definition I could find. So green infrastructure is a range of measures that use plant and soil systems, so living and natural systems, permeable pavement or other permeable surfaces or substrates. So instead of traditional pavement, it uses things that can absorb water or allow water to move in it, more similar to natural systems. Substrate, stormwater harvest or reuse, so holding on to water and reusing it more slowly, or reusing it in place of treated water. Or landscaping to store, infiltrate, evapotransport stormwater and reduce flows to sewer systems or surface waters. So this is both things getting into your stormwater system, but also just running off directly into streams. So it looks like things like these rain gardens or garden boxes shown here, where you plant plants that can help infiltrate and hold water so that is released more slowly into stormwater systems. But it can look like a ton of different things, and I do not have time to go through this, and I'm already running out of time. So here are 3 of the common ones that I think a lot of residential spaces can really benefit from and are easy to install, or relatively easy to install. So that's rain barrels that harvest water off of your roof. And it has kind of 2 benefits of slowing down that water running off, but it also means you don't have to use treated water from from your well water or from a treatment system. And instead you get to use already soft water. And if you have hard water in your well, this is pre-softened water that you don't need to even worry about. So another plus for your garden. And then also permeable pavement, which looks like a lot of different things, but it can be really beautiful and allow for more infiltration of water rather than just running off your driveway or patio into the storm sewer. And then lastly, this is an example of a rain garden. And I showed this one because I found it really attractive, but it also looks different. So rain gardens can look like a lot of different things. And I recommend just poking around and seeing which ones stylistically you like and work with the style of your landscape and being open-minded about what this might look like. Because I think a lot of people think of them as prairie planting looking spaces, and it can look like a lot of different things. So there are just a lot of options. And then the last category is how to conserve water, which I'm sure many of you have thought about before. So things like limiting lawn watering and watering your plants using rain barrels is a great option. Using low flow fixtures from toilets to the shower head shown here. Only washing full loads of both laundry and dishwashers. And the plus also about having full loads of laundry is if you have full load of laundry, it actually reduces the amount of fibers and microplastics shed by your clothes. So it's kind of a twofer. And fixing leaking and dripping faucets. And at the end of the day, this is up to you. So I hope while I'm taking questions and making a quick plug for the afternoon, I'm hoping you guys can put in the chat box, what is one thing you would like to try? And I think that's the place to start, is to look for where are you comfortable? Where can you come in and do your part to show love for the Great Lakes, protect them. And then once you are comfortable with that step, maybe thinking of one more. And this doesn't have to be an overwhelming process where you have to drink from a fire hose of all of the things you can do to save the Great Lakes. Instead, take a step and then take another. And together we can do a lot. So hopefully you'll put that in the chat. And one quick plug, we have some really awesome things in the afternoon. So please, if you're in the Port Washington area, please come out. I'll be out, but also a bunch of other really awesome folks talking about restoration happening in the area. Green sales will be at the Port Explorium, Birchwood Hills, great tours. Everybody who's giving a tour, I've seen them give tours before, and they are really awesome. So pick one that you like the topic of, and I hope to see you guys out there. Okay. I don't know if I have time for questions or not, but thanks.
There's a flurry of messages here that I'm trying to follow myself, Jen. Mostly people are very impressed with your very comprehensive presentation. Everybody hung in there. You were fabulous. And I think people will be looking for you out in the field this afternoon. And the whole program looks tremendous. So I'd say kudos to everyone. Tom, did you want to chime in and close it out?
Sure, we did have a flurry there, as you said, Susan. The chat room got very busy very fast, so it was interesting kind of watching all that. I did share an email for Jen, so if any of you wish to connect with Jen offline of today's Zoom program or even separate of the afternoon guided field tours, I know Jen's going to be out and about at a couple places. You can reach her via email. Jen, I know one question I saw come through here in this quick flurry. Maybe we'll just close with this. I think it's a perfect segue, of course, to where you're going to be this afternoon, talking through some of the different things that Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory is doing in the city of Port Washington, an incredible impact you all are having as an organization surrounded your neighborhood initiative. You want to maybe just offer a close with that? Because I think that's actually a perfect segue out.
Sure. So the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory is leading the Neighborhood Habitat Improvement Project, which is a project trying to improve residential landscapes for birds, pollinators, but also water quality. So water quality is really a part of it. And what we're trying to do is do actions that lift all of them up and make it as easy as possible. So trying to reduce barriers, make it easy, and help people do the right thing, because I'm sure all of you guys are on here to do good things for the Great Lakes. And hopefully you can learn more about that both on our website, but also by talking to me. And feel free to email me if you're more interested in that. It's mainly in Northern Ozaukee County now, but even if you're outside of the area, I would love to talk to you and share resources. So, and a lot of our partners are actually folks who are giving tours this afternoon. So I really recommend getting out there and learning from them and learning about the amazing stuff that's happening.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. Just a question that came in about the recording and information relative to our presentations. I'm assuming, I think our presenters, they will be very happy to share. So you will receive, as a registrant, subsequent to today, an email at some point during the week with the link to the recording, which you are certainly free to share forward, as well as the presenters' actual presentations. And then again, you have their email addresses so you can connect with them separately. So a real wealth of information. And beyond thanking, obviously, Jen and Paul and Dan and Russ, I just want to offer a heartfelt thank you to Susan and for serving as moderator and coming into the mix as part of our Love Our Great Lakes Day leadership team. It's always such a pleasure to work with you, Susan. And as always, you did a fantastic job moderating. So thanks for being the voice you are out in the community. And with that, I think I'm just going to bid adieu. It's 11:35. We're just a few minutes behind schedule. It gives you plenty of time to stretch, grab a bite for lunch, and hopefully head on out, as Jen said, into the city of Port Washington and surrounding areas for our guided afternoon visits. We look forward to celebrating and showcasing some of the important land and water conservation work that we are doing with so many great partners. So again, to one and all participants, presenters, of course, our funders and supporters, thank you all for a wonderful Love Our Great Lakes Day 2021. We look forward to sharing the event with you again in 2022. Thanks, everybody.